I never questioned the stories about my father until I found that photograph. It was tucked behind a loose board in my childhood bedroom closet, discovered during the painful process of cleaning out my mother's house after her funeral. The photo showed a man I'd never seen before, standing next to my mother in what appeared to be a hospital room. She was holding a newborn, presumably me, and both were smiling at the camera with the exhausted joy typical of new parents. But this man wasn't the father I remembered from countless family stories. Growing up, my mother had painted vivid pictures of Robert Hayes, my supposedly deceased father. She described his laugh, his favorite songs, even the way he used to read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. She kept a framed photo of him on the mantelpiece, a handsome man in military uniform who had allegedly died in a car accident when I was 3 months old. Yet here was photographic evidence of someone else entirely at my birth. The man in the hidden photo had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a gentle smile, and wore civilian clothes. Nothing like the rugged soldier whose memory had shaped my entire understanding of my origins. My hands trembled as I studied the image, searching for some logical explanation. Had my mother been married twice? Was this an uncle I'd never heard of? Or was something far more disturbing at play? I spent the next 3 days going through every box, every drawer, every hidden corner of the house. What I found, or rather, what I didn't find, chilled me to the bone. There were no military records, no death certificate, no insurance papers, nothing official about Robert Hayes. The only evidence of his existence were the stories my mother had told, and that single framed photograph. But there were other documents. Birth certificates, medical records, even old Christmas cards signed with a name I'd never heard before. Love, David. That night, I called my Aunt Sarah, my mother's only living sibling. When I described the man in the hidden photograph, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Oh, honey," she finally whispered, "we need to talk." The next morning, I drove 4 hours to Sarah's house, that mysterious photograph burning in my jacket pocket. As I sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the familiar smell of her lavender tea, she began to unravel 32 years of carefully constructed lies. "Your father's name was David Chun," she said, her voice barely audible. "He was a kind man, a librarian at the university where your mother worked. They were together for 2 years. But the military photos? The war stories? Robert Hayes." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother, she had such an imagination. After David left, he didn't die, sweetheart. He just left when she was pregnant. She created this whole fantasy. She convinced herself that a war hero father would be better for you than the truth." My world tilted on its axis. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, about the sacrifices that had shaped our family, about the hero whose legacy I tried to honor, all of it was fiction. But as I would soon discover, this was only the beginning of a much deeper deception. Finding David Chun should have been simple in the digital age, but it proved to be surprisingly complex. I started with the basics: online searches, social media platforms, professional directories. The name was common enough that I found dozens of David Chens, but none matched the age or description from my mother's era. I expanded my search to include university records from the 1990s, hoping to find some trace of the librarian who had supposedly worked alongside my mother at State University. After 3 weeks of dead ends, I decided to visit the university in person. The current head librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, was sympathetic but not particularly optimistic. "Employee records from the 90s are archived off-site," she explained, "but I can put in a request. It might take a few weeks." While waiting for official channels, I spent hours in the university's newspaper archives, scanning through decades of faculty photos, student publications, and campus event coverage. It was tedious work, but I was determined to find some evidence that David Chun had actually existed. Then I found her. In a 1992 issue of the Campus Quarterly, there was a photo from the annual staff picnic. I recognized my mother immediately. She looked exactly as I remembered her from childhood, with her distinctive curly hair and warm smile. She was standing next to a man who matched the figure from my hidden photograph perfectly. Wire-rimmed glasses, gentle expression, about 30 years old. The caption read, Library staff enjoying the annual picnic. Left to right, Margaret Stevens acquisitions, James Potter reference, Lisa Hartwell, my mother's maiden name, David Chen research collections, and Patricia Williams interlibrary loans. My heart pounded. Here was proof that David Chun was real, that he had worked with my mother, that at least part of Aunt Sarah's story was true. But this evidence also raised new questions. If David had existed, if they had worked together, what had really happened between them? I photographed the newspaper page and immediately called Mrs. Rodriguez. When I explained what I'd found, her tone changed completely. David Chun, she repeated slowly. You know, that name does sound familiar. Let me make some calls to our retired staff members. Someone might remember him. 2 days later, she called back with a phone number. I spoke with Patricia Williams, she said. She retired 5 years ago, but she remembers David very well. She's willing to talk to you. That afternoon, I sat in Patricia's suburban living room, my notebook ready, my phone recording our conversation with her permission. What she told me shattered what little I thought I understood about my origins. David was a lovely man, Patricia began, quiet, thoughtful, incredibly dedicated to his work. And he was absolutely devoted to your mother. They were inseparable for about 2 years. Everyone expected them to get married. But he left when she got pregnant. Patricia frowned. Left? Oh dear, no. David didn't leave. He was transferred. Transferred to the main campus library system in Denver. It was a promotion he'd been working toward for years. Your mother was supposed to go with him. They'd been planning it for months. But then she found out she was pregnant, and everything changed. The room felt like it was spinning. What do you mean, everything changed? Well, David was thrilled about the baby. He postponed the transfer, started looking for local positions, even talked about converting the spare room in his apartment into a nursery. Patricia paused, studying my face. He wanted to marry your mother and raise the child together. Then what happened? Patricia's expression grew troubled. This is where things get strange. About a month before you were born, your mother started acting very oddly. She avoided David, wouldn't return his calls, and eventually told everyone that he'd abandoned her. But that wasn't true. David was desperately trying to reach her. He even came to the library every day, hoping to talk to her. I felt sick. How do you know this? Because I was there. I saw him crying in the stacks, begging anyone who would listen to help him understand what had gone wrong. And then one day, your mother accused him of harassment and threatened to involve campus security. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was horrifying. So he took the transfer to Denver. He had no choice. But he left his contact information with several of us, begging us to call him when you were born. He wanted to be part of your life, to support both of you. Patricia's voice broke slightly. We never called him. Your mother made us promise we wouldn't. She said he was dangerous, that he'd threatened her. As I drove home that evening, my mind raced with implications. My mother hadn't just created a fictional father. She had erased my real father from existence. But why? What had driven her to such an elaborate deception? More importantly, if David Chun was still alive, could I find him after more than 3 decades? Armed with Patricia's information and a Denver forwarding address from 1993, I began the most intensive investigation of my life. The address led to an apartment complex that had been demolished in 2001, but the property management company still had forwarding records. David Chun had lived there for exactly 1 year before moving to another address across town. Each lead generated another lead, creating a paper trail that I followed with the persistence of a detective tracking a fugitive. What emerged was the portrait of a man who had never stopped looking for me. Through public records, I discovered that David had hired a private investigator in 1994, just months after my birth. The investigators archived files, which I accessed through a contact at a detective agency, contained detailed reports about my mother's movements during my early childhood. David had known about our apartment changes, my enrollment in different schools, even my mother's various job changes over the years. But what shocked me most was finding out that he'd been sending money. Hidden in the investigators' files were copies of money orders, sent monthly to a post office box registered under my mother's maiden name. From 1993 to 2010, 17 years, David Chun had been sending $300 every month, totaling over $60,000 in child support for a child he'd never been allowed to see. My mother had been collecting this money while telling me we struggled financially, while accepting sympathy from friends and family about being a single mother abandoned by a deadbeat father, while building an entire mythology around my heroic but deceased military father. The money orders stopped in 2010, and I feared the worst. Had David given up? Had he died? The trail seemed to go cold until I thought to check marriage records. In 2011, David Chun had married Susan Liu in a small ceremony in Boulder, Colorado. The wedding announcement in the local paper mentioned that David worked as a senior researcher at the University of Colorado's East Asian Library. Finally, a current lead. I spent a sleepless night crafting an email to the university library, asking to speak with David Chun about a personal family matter. I tried to strike a tone that was professional but urgent, hoping he wouldn't dismiss it as spam or some sort of scam. The response came within 2 hours. This is David Chun. I believe you may be my son. I've been waiting 32 years for this message. We arranged to speak by phone that evening. As 7 p.m. approached, I paced my apartment, rehearsing what I might say to the father who had been erased from my existence. How do you compress 3 decades of absence into a single conversation? When I finally dialed his number, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Hello. The voice was exactly as I'd imagined from Patricia's description, gentle, thoughtful, carrying the weight of years of wondering. This is... I started, then realized I didn't even know what name to use. The surname on my birth certificate was my mother's maiden name, not his. This is your son, I think. I'm Lisa Hartwell's son. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My God, he whispered. You found me. I never stop hoping, but I thought after so many years. What's your name, son? Michael. Michael Hartwell. Michael. He repeated it like a prayer. I used to imagine what your mother might name you. I had hoped. Well, that doesn't matter now. Are you okay? Are you healthy? Happy? The genuine concern in his voice, the immediate parental instinct after more than 3 decades of separation, broke something open inside me. I started crying right there on the phone. 32 years of grief for a father I'd never known I was mourning. I thought you were dead, I managed to say. She told me you were dead. I'm very much alive, Michael. And I've thought about you every single day since you were born. We talked for 4 hours that night. David told me about the monthly money orders, about the private investigator, about the years of wondering if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I even knew he existed. He told me about Susan, who had known about me from the beginning of their relationship and had encouraged his efforts to find me. But the most devastating revelation came near the end of our conversation. Michael, he said carefully, there's something else you should know. I didn't just send money all those years. I wrote letters too. Every month, along with the money order, I sent a letter addressed to you. Pictures of myself, stories about my life, explanations of what had happened. I wanted you to know that I never chose to leave, that I loved you from the moment I knew you existed. I never received any letters. I know that now, but I kept copies of everything. Hundreds of letters, photographs, even small gifts I hoped your mother might give you someday. I have 32 years of correspondence with a son I'd never met. The scope of my mother's deception was staggering. She hadn't just invented a fictional father. She had actively prevented me from knowing my real father while financially benefiting from his desperate attempts to be part of my life. But there was one more revelation waiting for me, one that would transform everything I thought I understood about family, memory, and the stories we tell ourselves to survive. Meeting David in person was both exactly what I expected and completely surprising. We arranged to meet halfway between our cities, in a small coffee shop in Kansas that neither of us had any emotional connection to. I arrived 30 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly because I wanted to observe him before he saw me. I needed those few moments to process the reality of his existence before the complexity of our relationship began. When he walked through the door at exactly 2 p.m., I recognized him immediately, despite the decades that had passed since the hidden photograph. His hair was gray now, and lines mapped the years around his eyes, but the gentle expression was unchanged. He scanned the room until our eyes met, and I watched his face transform with recognition and something deeper, a parent seeing their child for the first time in 32 years. The embrace was awkward at first. How do you hug someone who is both a stranger and the most fundamental relationship you've never had? But as we held each other, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of physical connection to my origins, a recognition that went deeper than conscious memory. Over the next 6 hours, David shared the letters he'd written but never sent. He'd brought a large box filled with handwritten pages, photographs, newspaper clippings he thought might interest me, even small gifts he'd hoped to give me on birthdays and holidays. It was like receiving 32 years of Christmas mornings all at once. Reading his letters was devastating and healing simultaneously. Here was evidence of a father who had chronicled every stage of my development from a distance, who had celebrated my achievements based on information from his private investigator, who had worried about my struggles and wished he could offer guidance and support. In a letter written when I was 7, he'd included a photo of himself at that age, noting our resemblance, and wondering if I'd inherited his love of books. At 10, he'd written about wanting to teach me to ride a bike, not knowing I'd already learned. At 16, he'd included college brochures, hoping I was thinking about my future and wishing he could help with applications and finances. The most heartbreaking entries were for my college graduation and my mother's funeral, events he'd known about but couldn't attend. "I drove to your graduation," he admitted as I read through the box. "I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours, wondering if I had the right to be there, if seeing me might hurt you or cause some kind of scene. In the end, I couldn't do it. I was afraid of disrupting the most important day of your life." But it was Susan, his wife, who provided the insight that finally helped me understand my mother's motivations. David told me about Lisa from our first date. She said when we spoke by phone that evening, he was still heartbroken after all those years, still blamed himself for somehow failing both of you. But from what he described, I always suspected she was struggling with something deeper than just fear of abandonment. "What do you mean?" "Mental illness doesn't excuse what she did to both of you, but it might explain it. The elaborate fantasy about the military father, the systematic erasure of David's existence, the ability to maintain such a complex deception for decades, that suggests someone who was disconnected from reality in some fundamental way. I thought about my childhood, about my mother's occasional strange behaviors that I dismissed as eccentricity, her insistence on certain versions of family stories, her anger when I asked too many questions about my father, her tendency to rewrite history when it suited her emotional needs. She wasn't evil," Susan continued. "She was probably trying to protect you from what she perceived as threats, even if those threats only existed in her mind. David represented abandonment to her, so she created a father who could never abandon you because he was already gone." This perspective helped, but it also raised new questions. If my mother had been capable of such an elaborate deception about my father, what else had she fabricated? How much of my childhood memories could I trust? How many other family stories were complete fiction? I decided to dig deeper into our family history. Using genealogy websites and public records, I began fact-checking every family story my mother had ever told me. What I discovered was that the fictional father was just the beginning. My supposedly deceased grandfather had actually lived until I was 12. The dramatic story of my grandmother's immigration was completely fabricated. She'd been born in Ohio. The family tragedy that had shaped my mother's childhood had never happened. My entire understanding of my family history was built on lies. But the most shocking discovery came when I accessed my mother's medical records, which I was able to obtain as her next of kin. Buried in her psychiatric evaluations from the 1990s, evaluations I'd never known existed, was a diagnosis that explained everything: delusional disorder with elaborate systematic delusions. The psychiatrist's notes described my mother's complex false belief system regarding family history and personal relationships, and her remarkable ability to maintain internally consistent fictional narratives. The doctor had recommended ongoing treatment and medication, but the records showed that my mother had stopped attending appointments after just 3 sessions. She had known, at some level, that her version of reality wasn't accurate. But she had chosen the delusion over treatment, the fiction over truth, the elaborate lie over the painful complexity of real relationships. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by David's letters and my mother's medical records, I realized that everything I thought I knew about memory, family, and identity had been fundamentally wrong. But there was one final revelation waiting for me, one that would challenge everything I'd learned about the nature of truth itself. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, my own therapist. After weeks of processing the revelations about my father and my mother's delusional disorder, I'd sought professional help to make sense of the psychological impact of learning that my entire childhood narrative had been fabricated. Dr. Sarah Martinez listened patiently as I recounted the story, taking careful notes and asking thoughtful questions. But during our 4th session, she asked something that stopped me cold. "Michael, I want you to think carefully about this. You said you have vivid memories of your mother telling you stories about your military father. Can you remember a specific instance? A particular conversation where she described his death or showed you his photograph?" I closed my eyes and tried to recall a specific moment. I could picture the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, could remember the general story about the car accident, could even recall the emotional weight of believing I'd lost a father I'd never really known. But when I tried to pinpoint an actual conversation, a specific moment when my mother had told me these stories, I came up empty. "That's strange," I admitted. "I know she told me about him, but I can't remember when or how." Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "What if she didn't tell you? What if you created those memories yourself?" The possibility was terrifying. But the photograph, the stories. "You said the photograph was on the mantelpiece. Did you ever ask your mother about it directly? Did you ever have a conversation where she explicitly told you that man was your father?" I searched my memory frantically, but the more I tried to recall specific interactions, the more uncertain I became. The stories felt real, the memories seemed solid, but under examination, they became increasingly fragile. "There's a phenomenon in psychology called confabulation," Dr. Martinez explained. "The brain's tendency to fill in memory gaps with plausible but false information. Children are especially susceptible to this, particularly when trying to make sense of confusing family situations." Over the next several sessions, we carefully deconstructed my childhood memories. What emerged was a stunning possibility. My mother may never have explicitly told me the military father story at all. The photograph on the mantelpiece might have been there without explanation. My young mind, trying to understand why I didn't have a father while other children did, might have created an entire narrative around that image. The story of the heroic father who died in a car accident could have been my own childish attempt to make sense of his absence. And once that false memory was established, it became the foundation for 32 years of false beliefs about my identity. But what about other people? I protested. Surely someone would have corrected me if I was telling a completely fabricated story about my father. "Think about it," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Who would you have told this story to? Children, mostly, who wouldn't have known the truth. And adults who did know, like your Aunt Sarah, might have been protecting your mother's privacy or assumed that you'd been told an age-appropriate version of events." The implications were staggering. I had potentially spent decades living in a false reality that I had created myself, based on misinterpreted visual cues and the natural human need to construct coherent narratives about our origins. To test this theory, I called several of my mother's old friends and colleagues, people who had known us during my childhood. I asked them carefully about what they remembered of my mother's stories about my father. The responses were revealing. Most remembered my mother being vague about my father's identity. Some recalled her deflecting questions or changing the subject when asked direct questions. None of them could remember her ever specifically claiming that my father was a dead military hero. The evidence suggested that my mother, struggling with her own mental health issues, had simply avoided discussing the painful truth about David's departure. She had left visual cues, the mysterious photograph, the absence of any father figure, without providing explanation. And I, as a child desperate for answers, had constructed an elaborate story to fill that vacuum. But the most haunting discovery came when I found my old elementary school journals, stored in a box in my mother's attic. In second grade, I had written, "My daddy is a soldier who died in a car. Mom cries when I ask about him, so I don't ask anymore." In fourth grade, I wish my daddy could see me play soccer. He would be proud of me if he was still alive. By sixth grade, Mom showed me a picture of my dad in his uniform. He was very brave and died protecting our country. Reading these entries, I realized that my childhood self had gradually transformed the basic facts, father absent, mother sad, into an increasingly elaborate narrative. Each retelling had added new details, new emotional weight, until the fiction had become indistinguishable from memory. The final shock came when I examined the photograph that had been on our mantelpiece for so many years. Using photo editing software to enhance the image, I discovered something I'd never noticed before. The uniform wasn't military at all. It was a security guard's uniform, probably from a part-time job or community volunteer position. My child's mind had seen man in uniform and constructed military hero to fill the emotional need for a father worth grieving. As I sat in my apartment on that final night, surrounded by evidence of how completely memory could be fabricated, I realized that the investigation into my father's identity had revealed something far more profound than family secrets. It had shown me that our entire sense of self, our understanding of who we are and where we come from, can be built on foundations that exist only in our minds. The stories we tell ourselves about our origins, our families, our very identities, they can be as fictional as any novel, yet feel as real as physical pain. My mother hadn't stolen my father from me. We had both, in our different ways, stolen reality from ourselves, choosing comfortable fictions over difficult truths. The difference was that I had been given a second chance to choose truth, while she had been trapped in her delusions until death. Today, I have a relationship with David, tentative but growing stronger. We're learning to be father and son in our 50s and 60s, building new memories to replace the fabricated ones. But I'll never again trust memory the same way. Every family story, every childhood recollection, every foundational belief about my past, all of it is now suspect, potentially another fiction masquerading as fact. The father who never existed taught me that sometimes the most important truths aren't about what happened, but about how our minds work to protect us from realities too painful to bear. And sometimes, the greatest act of love isn't preserving family stories, but having the courage to question whether they ever happened at all.